All right, Ngaji Guruji everyone, g'day. I'm Jards, I work for Rangelands NRM here at lovely Lottery's house. We're here on Juganyaru country in Broome, and we're lucky enough to live right on the edge of Roebuck Bay, which is a Ramsar listed wetland. Now, we all know it's incredible up here. It's a beautiful place, and it's an absolute stunner for biodiversity values, cultural values, and of course all the great fishing. One part of Roebuck Bay that we need to keep in mind though is that for a lot of our nutrients from the town right next to Roebuck Bay go and wash down the drains into Roebuck Bay, it does cause algal blooms. So one thing that we can all do to try and reduce that is to look after our gardens and reduce the amount of nutrient load that we put into the town and put onto the ground that then come wet season can get washed down into the bay. So one thing that's really handy for that is to go and make yourself some good old-fashioned compost. So that's what we want to do here today. I'm going to show you how I make a compost. I'm following Dr. Elaine Ingham's soil food web recipe, an absolute pioneer of the soil food web and soil health, and very much helping out in the whole regenerative ag sphere. So look, this is a great recipe that should give you a balanced bacterial to fungal recipe. It gives you a good soil food web to really get your garden going without the need for all your nasty synthetics, herbicides, pesticides and all that stuff as well, because with a healthy garden you'll keep those pests and diseases away. So I'll introduce you to the players in tonight's game. So as part of a good compost, we've got three key components. We've got the hot party foods, as Dr. Elaine Ingham says. That's your manures. So I'm very lucky to have a bit of help from Red Sun Camels out here in Broome to give us some of this beautiful camel poop. Nice manure, and that's high in nitrogen. That nitrogen is really going to get all the goodies, all the little soil bugs going and having a big old party. So that's the party food that gets it heated up and gets the things happening and keeps the microbes turning over and duplicating as such. Next, we've got our greens, which aren't always as straightforward as it might seem. Obviously, we've got our grass clippings, which are fantastic green material. We've also got a few food scraps there and some more grass clippings. But one we can also chuck in there that isn't necessarily green, but it counts as greens, is coffee grounds. So thank you very much to the Good Cartel for giving us a few coffee grounds, which are a beautiful, rich resource of all sorts of goodies that can also be really handy in a compost pile. One thing to note though with coffee grounds and anything that's really fine, and we'll talk about this in a second, but we want to make sure there's plenty of air for all our bugs. Our bugs need plenty of air, and that's very fine material, so we need to mix it with some of this more airy material to make sure it doesn't compact and turn into a nasty little mess of compacted goodies. So that's our greens. So we've got our party food, our hot food, we've got our greens, and now we've got our browns, which are a little bit more straightforward. Brown material is high in carbon, and things like dried leaves, so they're not green anymore, they're dried. If they were still green, they'd be in the green buckets. Neem leaves are a good one, just as a pointer. But brown material, high carbon, it's food for your fungi. And everyone needs some fungi at a party. And they are an important part of our soil food web. So we like to have a good amount of brown carbon in that pile to really keep them going. And it also balances our hot foods. Now, when I say balance, that's because through this whole pile and this whole process, we want to try and achieve what's called a carbon-nitrogen balance of about 30-1. Now, why is that important? Well, you, me, leaf of lettuce, some of the leaves on that tree, a lot of our microbes are all about that same 30-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So that's the kind of perfect ratio for them to get the food they need and turn out a lot of soil, to reproduce and create a lot of life in this compost pile. So we're going for that 30-1 recipe, and essentially we go about 10 to 20%. I'm going to use a slightly richer mix of 20% of the party food, about 30%, or I've got 3 buckets here of the green materials, and then I'm going to mix that with 50% brown materials. So that's going to be our mix, and we will make a big old party of compost in our epic little ring over here that we'll show you in a second. So let's get into it. Guys, the key thing with your compost is to make sure you've got the right amount of moisture in the pile. Now, like I said, we're dealing with the soil food web. Really important to keep that in mind. We're basically building a big old party of little microscopic pets. And because of that, they need a bit of water to drink, but they also don't want to be drowned. And there's a key balance that we're trying to aim for there, is about a 50% moisture. Now, what does that mean? I'll show you in a minute, but you can squeeze test the material once I've mixed it, and you can gauge how whether it's just on that Goldilocks correct amount of moisture or not, as to how many drops come out. But I'm just giving some of these materials a little bit of a wet up just to get them a little bit moist. Not too much, just to get it all started. And with your brown materials, they're going to be really dry, so you can add plenty of water to them. I've got this whole bucket of leaves soaking. Whereas your materials, your greens, have already got a bit of moisture in them, so they don't need that much. Your poop can also not need that much, so just a little spray just to get it a little bit wet, but plenty for your browns. And then we're going to get mixing on the top. All right, that little guy can fill up there, and it works great to let your browns kind of soak essentially in that. Meanwhile, let's check this material. How are we going? Don't want to add too much water. So I mentioned the recipe. So when we're mixing a recipe, as I said, I'm using Dr. Elaine Ingham's recipe because I'm a big student of the soil food web. And she's got it pretty down pat, and she believes in making a good compost. So she's a good one to follow. So we want to go 20% of our manure, 30% of our greens, and then 50% of our browns. Now what I'm going to do is actually mix that in little bits rather than all at once, because that's a bit much. I'll mix it in little portions, aliquots for those playing the crossword at home. And I'll mix that on the top there, and then throw it into our kind of ring, which, as you can see, nice and open. It's going to allow plenty of airflow into the compost pile as it breathes and parties on. But yeah, I'll mix them in batches essentially. So each batch will have. So I've got 10 of these buckets. They're 60-litre buckets. I've got 2 of the manure, so that's 20%. 3, they're a little under full, but let's just go with it. 3 of the greens, which are another 30%. And then I'll have 5 of the browns, which I'm just going to use 1 bucket to fill up. So that's given that a little bit of moisture. As I said, we want to get that nice and moist. But we'll mix it in sections in those portions, but in the right ratios. So there we go. We'll start with the browns. These have been soaking up, some leaves that have been soaking up. I'll just chuck them out there on the top. Keep in mind, we really want to mix everything. You want to get everything nice and mixed in with everything else. And that's important to make sure there's the right. The microbes are pretty small, they can't walk that far. So you need everyone to have a fair crack at the party, and have a fair bit of food to keep them on the D floor. Being conscious should let some of this material drain out a bit. You don't want too much of that moisture in there. If you have too much moisture, as I said, you will drown all your microbes, you'll drown your pets, and no one wants drowned pets. That's what's called turning it anaerobic. It's not aerobic. Aerobics, like the fun kind of 80s dance stuff, uses a lot of oxygen. Anaerobic, not so much oxygen. Now all of our pathogens, all of our nasties are generally anaerobic. So if we keep things nice and aerobic, we avoid inviting those not so nice crew to the party, if you get my drift. So that's the plan. All right, so that's about 1 bucket or 60 litres worth of brown material. I'm now going to chuck in a few greens. So almost a whole bucket of these basically, but not the whole one. Remember, I'm dividing this into 4. And I only got 3 greens, so that was a bit tricky. My maths could have made life easier for myself, but that's all right. And 1/4 of our manure is about half a bucket, right? So that one's not too hard. Dump about half a bucket of this lovely camel poop from our beautiful Broome camels that do the rides. You guys, if you ever visit Broome, you may have come across the camel that gave us these goodies. All right, so as we're going along, we always want to be conscious, as I said with the coffee grounds, I want to be conscious of material that's clumped up or compacted, because again, that's not going to let your, fluoro wearing aerobic party continue in there. If it's compacted like that, it's just not going to, it's going to go anaerobic, and you're going to have the shady characters that produce all the nasty little chemicals come along and hang out in there. So even with this poo, you want to be conscious of the little nuts and see where you can. If you can break them up, that's even better. Just getting this a little bit fluffed up and ready for the next portion. I might even chuck a little bit extra in there because I've probably been a bit conservative. There we go. It's more like it. So that's about 1/4. Cool. With said mixing and trying to make stuff not too clumpy, one of these can sometimes be pretty handy to just try and break up little clumps. This is the modern way of composting. Just breaks up some of the little lumpy clumps of goodness. You're going to have a few, but you want to get rid of as many as you can, ideally. Now guys, I mentioned the moisture before, and I noticed that the manure has actually got a bit dry, but this, when you're mixing your kind of portion on the tarp, there's an opportunity to mix that up, and between your kind of browns, greens and poop, check how you're going with that moisture, and then make a bit of a judgment. And if you need to, you've got the hose there and you can add a little bit of moisture if it needs it. Always easier to add afterwards than try and take it away. So I've gone with that principle, and we'll mix it quickly and then see how it's all looking. So I want to try and get rid of these clumps. It's a big clump of grass, and try and turn it over a bit. Mix it in with those leaves, mix it in. And they also had plenty of moisture on them, so that's going to help get a bit more moisture into the pile. So this is about a 1/4 of our kind of whole mix. I've mixed in the greens, the browns and the poop all together into a nice happy big pile. Now, I mentioned moisture. Looking at this pile, it's probably looking a touch dry, and like I said, some of that manure is probably a bit dry, didn't have a lot in it. A really easy way to test, grab yourself a big old handful, and you might need to do this a few times. Grab yourself a handful, give it a really good bunch it together. Get a real handful, bunch it together, give it a good squeeze. If you get 1 drop out of that handful after a really good squeeze, you're spot on the right amount of moisture. I'm giving it a squeeze. I'm not the toughest, biggest bloke in the schoolyard, but I'm not getting anything out of this, so I know it's not quite moist enough, and as we kind of suspected. So I'm going to add a bit of moisture to this to bring it up to about that 50% moisture, which is tip-top Goldilocks for all your microbes to have a big old party, but not drown. So I'll grab my hose and give it a bit of a squirt. One more little thing to add. In an ideal world, you would have chlorine-free water that's either been, if it's town water, it's been sat out for an hour or so, or you have rainwater or water that's straight from a bore that doesn't actually have any chlorine in it. Chlorine does kind of knock back your little microbes again, so it's ideal if you don't have it in there, but it's not going to be a complete deal breaker. Not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. So that's added a little bit of moisture there. I'm going to give it another quick turn and we'll see if we can get that, check that moisture again. And I might still need to add a little bit more water to it. One more little squirt, I reckon. All right, cool beans. So giving it a bit more moisture and we'll do our little moisture test again now, just to see if we've got it quite there. It's looking pretty good. So I've got my big handful of stuff. And if I give that a good squeeze, you can see a couple of drops coming out of the bottom there. I'm not sure if you can quite see that. Just a couple of drops coming off my hand here. There's actually a few too many drops coming out now. So I know I've got at least 50%, if not it's probably slightly over, which is fine. That's kind of hit the mark. I'll be conscious of how much water I've got there and make sure I don't put too much more in. But it's critical to get to that moisture level to really wet up your materials, especially in our hot climate here in Broome and north of Australia. Obviously don't want to go too far because then you're going to end up with everything being anaerobic, but you also want to make sure you've got enough water so everyone's got a drink. All right, now I've got that ready, set the right moisture, it's nice and mixed. That's now going into the almighty ring. So this is our first layer. So I'll shovel this in, and again, bit of an opportunity to mix things in as it gets thrown in. And I'll actually introduce you to what I've got set up here as the pile, if you like. And yeah, you can easily set something like this up at home with a few spare materials and a bit of cheap mesh from the hardware store. Allows plenty of air to get into the pile, which, as I said, very important to keep everyone in their spandex happy. So this is our material coming along. This is kind of our mix. Just that first kind of little section that we've done. She's in the little cage up on our pallet, so there's plenty of air coming in from underneath. And there's plenty of air that can get through from the sides. But air can only kind of diffuse into the pile about a foot, so 30 centimeters-ish, which means that there's going to be a good part of it in the very middle of this pile that might not really be able to get that much air into it. Now that's why you turn a compost. You've got to turn it over to get that oxygen back into it and fluff it back up. But another thing you can do is use some chimneys. So the work of David Johnson and his wife, they came up with this method, the Johnson-Su method, of using these as chimneys in your compost, which is pretty handy. Can save you turning as much as prescribed by Dr. Elaine Ingham to avoid turning it too much. As you can imagine, this is going to be a big old party of soil food web microbes and fungi. They don't exactly like their entire world turned upside down too much. They need the air, but turning them upside down is a little bit destructive in its own way. So by putting these chimneys in, you can let that air get in there without necessarily always having to turn it over. This is part of the static pile kind of method. So what I was going to do is just put a couple of these through the middle of this pile. So it's got a little bit of extra airflow coming in. And now I've got a little bit of material in there. It'll kind of just sit there. And as I fill it up, I'll put them into place. I am still going to turn this pile, again, following the soil food web school method. I'm going to aim for only about 2 turns. So it's that balance of making sure all the material gets moved, but also isn't super destructive. So I'm just going to wedge one of these guys into the bottom here. And that gets down to that. And it can sit in there. And I'll put another one in here. Put another one in here. Get your hands dirty. It's all good. Wash them afterwards. And I'm even going to go a 4th one in here. So everyone's got a chimney. All right. That should allow plenty of air. Into these once we've filled it up. All right, so stay there, guys. Behave yourselves. All right, so we're back onto mixing our material. Probably needed a little bit more brown in that first bit, so I'll put a little bit of extra brown in this one. And yeah, away we go. Now that's another benefit of doing a good compost, is that you won't have, or you shouldn't have, bad smells. Now everyone thinks, oh, compost, yuck, that'd be feral. If you're doing it wrong, you're not making compost, you're making putrefied organic material. When it gets anaerobic, so doesn't have enough air, you got the wrong bugs in there, they're gonna make all sorts of nasty putric acids and all sorts of nasty stuff you don't want. And it's actually very toxic to plants. They'll produce alcohols, they'll produce toxic gases. And not only is it toxic to plants, it's actually using up all the nice goodies, all the building blocks of life. You'll be losing your nitrogen to ammonia, which is a gas. You'll be losing your sulfur to gas, which is very poisonous. And you'll also be losing your phosphorus to potentially gas as well, which is very deadly. So not great to go down that route. And again, that is your anaerobic bugs. That's your bad bugs doing the wrong thing. That's what happens when you get them in the party rather than your good aerobic bugs. So all the more reason we want to try and keep things as aerobic as possible. 1 whole bucket, so half of our manure, our hot food. So half of our hot food's gone in. When I say hot, it's because it's high in nitrogen. High nitrogen is what makes your pile hot. And actually what's making it hot is your bacteria reproducing at a rapid rate. Reproduce every 20 minutes if things are ideal. And every million bacteria in a gram of soil that are reproducing, that produces, in that 20 minutes, if they reproduce, they duplicate themselves, and that produces a degree of heat. 1 degree per gram of soil. So you multiply that by a few other millions, billions, astronomical numbers, and all of a sudden you will have a hot compost pile. Now that's what we're going for here. The hot composting process is really important, and I believe it's been around for about as long as life's been around. Pretty sure the first bacteria were kind of these heat-loving or heat-tolerant species, because the world was pretty warm back in the day. We're talking 3-ish billion years ago. And it was an important process that started the formation of soil in reducing minerals into an kind of more organic matter. But But yeah, so anyway, getting off on a tangent. That is the, geez, coffee's heavy. So they're the thermophilic bacteria, so they come into the pile, do their thing, make it all hot. That heat will kill a lot of your pathogens and nasty bugs. It'll also help break down the material really well. Obviously things kind of, if they're cooking, imagine a slow cooker, it kind of breaks the materials down a bit more, and piles will get 50, 60, 70 degrees even in the middle, in the hot part of the pile. And that's what we're actually aiming for. Now, once it gets to that 70 degrees, that's as hot as you really want to get it. And why is because as soon as it starts to get that hot, there is that much activity that oxygen coming into the pile won't be able to keep up with the microbes doing their thing. And that in itself will put you in a position where you lose you lose your oxygen, you become anaerobic. And again, then all your not so cool crew roll into the party and start producing all sorts of nasty things. One of them to be mindful of is alcohols, and that then combusts at about 80 degrees. So there is a slight risk there, and all the more reason why you want to be careful and keep it aerobic. But yeah, basically once you get to that hot point, it only needs to be at that 70-ish degrees for a day, and you can turn it. You turn that pile, it'll kind of reduce that heat because it'll aerate things and move that heat around the pile. Should actually move a different section of the pile into that really hot middle, and then give that a crack at getting up to temperature. So that basically pasteurizes the center of the pile, gets rid of your bad bugs. It also gets rid of weed seeds and things like that, or it gets rid of any seeds in theory. So hence why you can put a bunch of materials into your pile without, if you do it properly, without the risk of, you know, if you put kind of your weeds from your garden clippings and stuff like that in there, it shouldn't actually sprout those weeds because the seeds should have been killed off. So yeah, that's the hot pile method, the hot compost method, and that's why you will see that steaming kind of pile action happen. But that's a good thing. You just got to manage it and monitor it. I'll show you my thermometer later. You poke a thermometer into the middle of the pile, watch it getting hot. Once it does get to that temperature, over about 55 for 3 days, up to, you know, if it's over 70, it only needs 1 day at that. You turn it over and let it have another crack. So yeah, so I've used half my manure. I've got 1.5 tubs of brown in this one, so I only put about 1 in the last mix, so I need to put an extra half in because I was after 5 tubs of brown, 3 tubs of green, 2 tubs of manure, so 20, 30, 50%. And yeah, I need to add a little bit of coffee to this one. Little bit of coffee, a little bit more greens because I'm splitting this by 4 and I had 3 buckets. We are down to the final quarter of material for our pile here at Lottery's house. This material's looking pretty good, nice mix of the last quarter of manure and brown and green all mixed together. I just grabbed a bit of a handful to do a little quick moisture test. This is looking a little bit wet. If we just give that handful a squeeze, a couple of drops coming out there, so it's a little bit over 50% moisture. So I don't want to add any more at this stage, any more moisture that is. I'll put this material on top and that extra moisture will get into the pile a bit. Hopefully it's not too much and it can be a little bit of extra water to help with our hot, dry climate up here at the moment in dry season in Broome. But yeah, thanks very much guys, and look forward to showing you when the pile's heated up. Cheers! Alright, so here's our compost, our attempt at Lane Ingham style hot compost about 6 weeks later. So it's been through its thermal process, it's done, it's had 2 turns to get that middle section, get each portion, each third of the pile through that middle section. and it reached staggering 72 odd degrees each time, so that was definitely enough temperature for pasteurization, breaking down weed seeds, breaking down pathogens, and it was then turned promptly to keep that aeration up. I did employ a bunch of chimneys, so there's there's a bunch of chimneys through the pile that are now kind of semi-covered by me scratching around in it, to really keep that aeration going through the pile. The surface, there's another chimney going down through there. The surface is definitely dried right off. We are here in Broome, in kind of dry tropical kind of climate, and you can see that this is very dry, but you remove just a shallow little section and you will get to plenty of moisture that's sitting down in there in the actual rest of the material. Worked out really well. We had a mix of 20% camel poo manure, 30% greens, including a bunch of coffee grounds, which are quite rich, and food scraps, grass clippings, fresh grass clippings, green stuff, and then about 50% of, you got it, brown stuff, mainly dried dead leaves from our beautiful garden here at Broome Lottery's house. So this is all put together. It worked very well. I would reflect that there probably was well and truly sufficient, more than sufficient, hot foods, party foods. So you could definitely go for something with more like 10% manure instead, especially if using something like coffee grounds as well. The material's beautiful. It's looking really good. There's still plenty of undecomposed material, but in general you can see the material's kind of decomposed to that beautiful dark chocolate coloured humic rich compost. Beautiful and fluffy, great structure, holds together when you squeeze it like that, but then obviously breaks apart, got a nice kind of tilt to it. You can also note I think we had a little bit of sand in there, quite a bit of sand from the manure. There was a bunch of actinobacteria that we did have in there, which wasn't a good sign. And again, comes back to that really high temperature. You see that as a white fuzzy kind of growth on things. But there's also been quite a lot of really good filamentous fungi growing, and I can actually see there's a little fungal cap as a bit of evidence again. Lots of fungi got going in here as well, and saw some great filamentous fungi. So you're really after that thick-stranded fungus, kind of almost mycorrhizal, perhaps. Obviously not, because there's no plants in here. Maybe. Don't take my word for that. But yeah, it was a great result to see. So it's come out really well. I need to have a look at this stuff under the microscope, and I'll put some pictures of the bugs into a little video as well. And there you go, right there. There's almost some filamentous. Phil, how you going? On that piece of manure, you can really see the strands. They're visible to the naked eye. That's generally a good sign. So we'll definitely have a look at some of those. Right now I'm going to give this a bit of a drink. As you can tell, it could probably need one. Don't we all? It is a Friday. And yeah, just to make sure this outside layer doesn't get any deeper. This dry outside layer doesn't get any deeper, and retain this moisture deeper in the profile for our bugs. I'll then probably go through, there's one of those chimneys. I'll then probably go and put some more of those chimneys in, or restore them, just to keep that air open. But we really, ideally, want to get on to using it. So we'll put this beautiful compost to good use, hopefully in our native bee garden out the back of Lottery's house. So yeah, guys, it's making compost, done with material that I got freely around town. Thanks again to Red Sun Camels for providing the camel goods. Good Cartel for providing the coffee goods, as well as our garden here for collecting a bunch of the leaves, and a lot of the Broome community for supplying a few extra veggie scraps as well as grass clippings. Really appreciate that. guys, much appreciated. Yeah, so that's all you need, and maybe a bit of materials as some way to put it together, and you can have your very own highly diverse, beautiful biology for your garden. And by doing that and spreading that love of compost pets, of soil food web pets onto your garden, you can help that soil increase its health to hold on to and cycle more nutrients for you and your veggies / garden, whatever you want to do. But yeah, thanks guys, and I'll look forward to showing you some images of the soil food web that we've got in here. Cheers!